Okay, well, this seems a very appropriate place to talk about Hayes and religion. Keep flipping. I put oh, you know what, Elizabeth? Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. I know that the staff is aware of this. I'm not sure if the Hayes family, if you all have seen some of the pictures yet from our centennial. So we've got a few here. That's Cokie Roberts giving the presentation from her husband's closet. As you'll recall, there was a tropical storm that kept her from attending. And I don't know how many of you have seen this. I know staff members, we've been following Rutherford and Lucy's Centennial Goodwill Tour very closely. Hayes family members, I don't know how many of you are aware or following our social media, but at some point in our planning for the Centennial, we thought it would be a lot of fun if life-size cutouts of Rutherford and Lucy visited all of the presidents of the United States. And so they left Spiegel Grove in January. That one in the top left corner is Rutherford and Lucy up in the attic of the home, clearly packing for their journey. And so Rutherford and Lucy each have they're not traveling together, they're traveling separately, otherwise we couldn't fit all the presidential sites in, and we wanted Lucy to visit. There are a few First Lady sites out there too. So go ahead, Elizabeth. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 of these. So Rutherford went to Mount Vernon first, and Lucy went to Abigail Adams. And we really appreciate the creativity that these sites are doing. It has been so much fun to get these pictures in. And so they post them to their social media, tag us, and we post them to our social media. And we've gotten quite a following. It's been a lot of fun. And actually, that's how our trip here to Washington, D.C. originated, because their last scheduled stop, we were going to send them to the White House Historical Association, and then they would appear in the White House, and that would be their last stop. That would conclude their Goodwill tour. And then we decided, well, heck, let's not send Rutherford and Lucy by themselves. They need an entourage, and what a fun way to close out this our centennial year. So that's how it started. These are, of course, 2 recent ones that we got in. Oh, and I mentioned, I think when we left Spiegel Grove, I mentioned that we had lost track of Rutherford. We weren't sure where he was, but he has turned up at the Reagan Presidential Library. So that is where he is now. So we have located him. So, okay, so Rutherford, this is a great place to talk about Rutherford's views on religion. And Rutherford actually wrote a lot about his religious views. And as those of us who are staff, and probably descendants are aware too, Rutherford was such a prolific writer, and he had kept a diary. He started writing in his diary when he was a teenager, abandoned it for a little while, but really started writing in it in earnest when he was a student at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. And in the early years of his writings about religion, I think probably his mother had sorry, Elizabeth and I were talking about how to signal that she's supposed to change the slide. So I'll work out a less annoying way to do it for the next series of slides. So this is Rutherford's mother, Sophia, and of course Rutherford did not know his father because his father died 2 months before he was born. And Sophia had a huge influence on Rutherford's religious views, and probably not at all in the way that she would have wanted. She herself was incredibly religious. She was a Presbyterian, and she was kind of a dour person. She was very melancholy. She was kind of grouchy. She was a little irritable. She had kind of a short, she's not a very patient person. But we can't be really too hard on her because she had a very difficult life. Rutherford's father, who was actually Rutherford Jr., and Sophia came from Vermont and settled in Delaware, Ohio. And Sophia had 5 children, and 2 of them died very young, and that left 3 children, Lorenzo and Fanny, and then Rutherford, the youngest. As I mentioned, Sophia's husband died 2 months before Rutherford was born, so Rutherford never knew his father. And then when her oldest son, Lorenzo, was about 9 years old, he drowned he was ice skating on the river there in Delaware, Ohio, and he drowned. So Sophia ends up with her 2 youngest children, Fanny and Rutherford, and has lost the rest of her family. So she went through a lot of hardship, and that certainly was something that was very upsetting to her. She turned to her faith to get her through those times, and Rutherford actually writes not only about his own religious views, but he does comment on his mother's religious views periodically too, because anytime something was going on in the world that was upsetting her, she was convinced that these horrible things were happening because God was punishing people, and so she would turn to her Bible and she would read for encouragement, but that's kind of the way that she viewed religion. Rutherford, on the other hand, felt that his mom was maybe a little too. He was baptized into he was baptized as a Presbyterian, which was the denomination that his mother was. But he felt like his mother was too strict in her definition of religion and how she used religion in her life. And so I think his religious views were almost a backlash to hers. He, in his mid-20s, he is reading a book called The History of the Reformation. And he makes this entry in his diary, April 15th, 1845. Oh, you know what? I think I have a picture of Uncle Sardis next. Go ahead and switch that. Okay, so here's Uncle Sardis. So since Rutherford's father had died, Uncle Sardis, Sophia's brother, steps in, kind of becomes that father figure role to him. Uncle Sardis is not particularly religious, and so I think as Rutherford is looking at the two of them, his mother and Uncle Sardis, he's a little bit more drawn to his Uncle Sardis's way of thinking than his mother's. So back to Rutherford's diary entry, April 15th, 1845. He's reading The History of the Reformation, and he jots down in his diary that the author makes 2 points. Christianity has 2 features which especially distinguish it from all human systems. Number 1, that the only mediator between God and man is Jesus Christ. Number 2, that salvation is a gift of God, a matter of graces. In this book, he writes, the author is constantly affirming that, in his opinion, the Reformation was the immediate work of the divine hand. Now, Rutherford goes on to put his 2 cents worth onto this. Now, it seems to me that providence interferes no more in the greatest affairs of men than in the smallest, and that neither individuals nor nations are any more the objects of a special interposition of the divine ruler than the innate things of the world. The Creator gave to every creature of his hand its laws at the time of its creation, and whatever can happen in accordance with those laws he doubtless foresaw. And it cannot be supposed that his laws are so imperfect that special interpositions are necessary to render them capable of fulfilling their design, nor that it is possible for them to be violated. The Reformation, like other revolutions, was agreeable to principles which have existed since the world began. So what he's saying is, if God created all these rules that, in order that the world was supposed to follow, then he wouldn't meddle in those because he set them up very perfectly. And he's almost, this is a little bit like deism to my way of thinking. And if you know anything about deism, it's the belief that when God created the world, he's almost like a clockmaker and setting up all these rules and this is how the clock is going to function, and winds it up and then lets the clock go as it's supposed to go. So that's kind of a little bit of what Rutherford is saying there. Go ahead and change the next slide. So this is Rutherford in his 20s, which would have been about the time that he would have made this particular diary entry. Go ahead. And this is, of course, his wife, Lucy. And Lucy probably had the greatest influence on his religious views, really more than anybody. And Lucy was almost Rutherford's polar opposite in religious views. Lucy was incredibly faithful, incredibly religious, a very spiritual person. But Lucy was raised in a household where religion was kind of a central feature. But as opposed to Sophia, who thought that religion and God were a way of punishing people, in Lucy's household, it was a way of welcoming all people, and it was something that was used as a method of making people's lives better. Lucy's father died when she was 2 years old, so neither she nor Rutherford really remember their fathers. They had that kind of life experience in common. Lucy's father died in Kentucky. He owned some slaves there that he had inherited. And so after his father died and Lucy's father inherited these slaves, that was not something that he supported, and so he went back to Kentucky to set these slaves free. And while he was there, he caught cholera and died. And some people made some remarks to Lucy's mother, oh, thank goodness that he actually hadn't had a chance to set the slaves free yet before he passed away, because now you will own them, and since you have no husband, you're going to need a way to financially support your family, so now you can sell these slaves and you can take that money. And Lucy's mother made a comment to the effect of, I would rather take washing and do washing to support my family rather than sell humans and live off of that money. So you can kind of get an idea of the household that Lucy grew up in and the values that they had. Lucy's maternal grandfather was Isaac Cook, and Isaac was an important person in Lucy's life. Isaac actually had taken a pledge in his life to abstain from alcohol, and he encouraged Lucy at a very young age to do the same thing, which she did. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Of course, we're very familiar with the fact that the Hayeses didn't serve alcohol in the White House, and Lucy's abstinence herself for most of her life, you can see that influence of her grandfather there. But her grandfather, Isaac Cook, was a very interesting person. He actually served in the Ohio State Legislature, where he advocated for temperance measures, and also a state-supported system of elementary education, which did not exist at the time. He actually also was, he wanted to create this system of people, because alcoholism was something that concerned him a lot. And he wanted to create a system whereby mentors would be created to help people who were alcoholics, to kind of counsel them and help them to stop drinking. And so he wanted to set up this kind of a program where it was he called it like a guardian system. And actually people really mocked him for that, and thought that was a ridiculous kind of a thing to do, and it cost him his 5th bid for election in the state legislature. And he actually died of pneumonia at the age of 75. He had been out writing around the country, giving temperance lectures, and he got caught in a storm and caught pneumonia from that and died. So this was a man who was very committed to the cause, to the temperance cause. So Lucy was raised in this very caring, very supportive environment. Her family, they were Methodists. And so the emphasis that was placed on her at a very young age was on caring for the less fortunate. So Lucy attends Wesleyan Female College in Cincinnati, and her commencement essay was entitled The Influence of Christianity on National Prosperity. And of course she thought that had a lot of impact on national prosperity. So again, you can see her religious views there. Now Lucy had lived for a period of time. She was born in Chillicothe, Ohio, and then when her father died, her mother moved to Delaware, Ohio, so that Lucy's 2 older brothers could go to school there. And of course, Rutherford was living in Delaware, and that's where they met. No sparks flew at their first meeting. Rutherford makes an entry in his diary years after they met, but they were 9 years apart in age, and so Lucy was 16 when they met, and he said in his diary, she was too young to fall in love with, so I didn't. But they reconnect in Cincinnati when Lucy's going to school there. and Rutherford was practicing law there. They knew each other and they reconnected, and so started seeing each other there quite frequently, and eventually married in 1852. So they're living in Cincinnati, and Lucy's mother Maria is living with them. Also, Lucy's brother Joe living with them periodically. Sophia also stays with them for a while. As Rutherford and Lucy start having children, Sophia does not really like a loud and boisterous household, and she thinks Lucy's being too liberal with the boys and letting them run all around and things like that. So sometimes Lucy is feeling some stress when Mother Hayes is in the household. While this is going on, Uncle Sardis starts to build the home there at Spiegel Grove, and he always kind of has in mind that Rutherford and Lucy are going to live there someday, so he consults Rutherford on the design, what should the house look like, and when Sophia catches word of the house that they're building, she writes this a letter to her brother Sardis, and this is what she puts. This is what she says in the letter. Careful men like you should not encourage extravagance in Ohio when there is so much need for money for preachers and teachers to instruct the ignorant that are so plenty among us. The character of our inhabitants is much more important than their style of living. So she was not in favor of the house that was being built there at Spiegel Grove. She thought it was entirely too pretty and unnecessary, and that those funds that Sardis had should not be going into a house, should be going to support the salaries of preachers and teachers. So gives you a little insight there. So Lucy, go ahead, because I think I have their wedding picture next. Okay, so this is their wedding picture, 1852. They're living in Cincinnati. Lucy, again, very devoutly religious. She was also very much opposed to slavery. And while Hayes himself didn't support slavery, he was a lawyer, and it was legal. So he was not as outspoken against it as Lucy was. And here's another thing that Lucy really has a big influence on him, because after they're married and living in Cincinnati, he takes on very strongly her anti-slavery views. And this is what then draws him into the Republican Party. And at this time, he is barely eking out a living. He's taking on some cases and managing to get by, but he also starts defending people that not a lot of other people would have wanted to take on these cases. He took on some high-profile murder cases and defended and didn't doubt his client's guilt. He fully believed that his clients in several of these cases had committed murder, but he also believed that they were mentally ill. He felt that they were insane, and that because they committed murder didn't automatically mean the death penalty. He thought that they should have some help, and he thought that they should have some treatment. And so we see this kind of forming his character at this time. So when the Civil War breaks out, and again, April 15th, 1861, so this is right around the time that Fort Sumter has been fired upon by federal troops down in South Carolina, which marks the beginning of the war. Rutherford writes in his diary that his mother feels the country is being punished for the sins of its people, and she's reading the Old Testament vigorously. Go ahead, Elizabeth, I think I have. Okay, so this is Hayes. He enters the war not as a general, but as a major, spends most of the war as a colonel. And he enlists shortly after the firing of Fort Sumter, and makes the comment in his diary about how he would rather enter the war knowing that he was going to be killed than sit out of it. He and Lucy are both very much committed to the cause, so there was no question that he was going to enlist. So he does, and he has been away from his family for several months during that first year in 1861, and he makes this diary entry. October 29th, 1861. Queer world, we fret our little hour, are happy and pass away. Away, where to? This longing after immortality, these thoughts that wander through eternity. I have been and am an unbeliever in all these sacred verities. But will I not take refuge in the faith of my fathers at last? Are we not all impelled to do this? The great abyss, the unknown future. Are we not happier if we give ourselves up to some settled faith? Can we feel safe without it? Am I not more and more carried along, drifted towards surrendering to the best religion the world has yet produced? It seems so. In this business, as I ride through the glorious scenery this loveliest season of the year, my thoughts float away beyond this wretched war and all its belongings. Some, yes, many glorious things, as well as all that is not so, impress me. And I think of the closing years on the downhill side of life and picture myself a Christian, sincere, humble, devoted, as conscientious in that I am now in this life, but not more so. My belief in this war is as deep as any faith can be. And then he's recalling some friends that he used to know in Cincinnati, and he says, in thinking of all this, this leads me to long for such a similar communion in perfection, not known on earth, and to hope that in the future there may be a purer joy, forever and ever. And as one wishes, so he drifts. While these enjoyments are present, we have little to wish for. As they slip from us, we look forward and hope, and then believe with the college theme, there is more beyond. And for me to believe is to act and live according to my faith. So he clearly says right in the beginning of this quote, I don't believe in these sacred verities. These doctrines that I'm hearing about are not something that I actually believe in, but I kind of picture myself a Christian. So you can sort of see what he is struggling with as he writes, and he wants to believe that there is something more beyond, that there is something else when we die, that we have a better place to go to. But you can see his struggles as he thinks through this. He's not entirely sure. But about the same time, he gets a letter from Lucy, and she's talking about how the church that they're going to in Cincinnati has split now into these pro-slavery, anti-slavery, pro-union, rebel sections of the church. And so Hayes responds to her letter, and this is what he says. Lieutenant Christie of General Cox's staff tells me that Union Chapel has had a division and troubles. Sorry to hear it. If you are compelled to leave, be in no haste to choose a new church. But I want to confer on that subject. I think it important to be connected with a church and with the right one. Mere nearness is important. This would favor the church near 7th and Mound if you can consent to go to a Presbyterian church. But of this hereafter. So now he's being very practical, and advising Lucy, don't leave this, don't just do it, we got to talk about this. But on the other hand, too, he's saying, it's important to be connected to a church, but whether the church is geographically close to you is of an important consideration, not its theology. So, so Hayes makes another diary entry too. This is a little bit later, but so he's going to church with Lucy, and he's reading his Bible, but he doesn't consider himself a Christian. He doesn't actually take that step to make that statement. And so this is what he writes about. He's been reading the diary. He's been writing in his diary, but he's been reading the Bible, and he says, have been reading Genesis for several Sundays, not as a Christian reads for spiritual consolation or instruction, but neither as an infidel reads to carp, quarrel, and criticize, but as one who wishes to be informed in the earliest and most wonderful of all literary productions. The literature of the Bible should be studied as one studies Shakespeare, for illustration and language, for its true picture of men's and women's nature, and for its earliest historical record. So here's where we see Hayes the scholar reading the Bible, again, not for spiritual guidance, but analytical, and as a piece of literature. Well, the war closes. He of course, ends the war as a general. And while he was in the war, he is elected to Congress. But he says, I'm not actually going to take my seat because I'm kind of busy here. We're in a war. And when the war's over, that's when I will take my seat. And so that's exactly what happens. The war ends, and he goes to take his seat in Congress. Now, when he was elected and his mother gets the news in her ever-supportive way, she says, Washington, D.C. is a horrible, wicked place, and you don't belong out there, and if you go out there, you're going to come back an alcoholic like your uncle did. So she's not happy that he's doing this at all, and doesn't agree with it, and again, starts to pray that her son does not pick up the vices that she perceives as being inherent to Washington, D.C. The year 1866, the year after the war ends, Hayes is now in Congress, and this was a very, very difficult year for the Hayes family because their young son George dies of scarlet fever. Lucy's mother Maria dies in September, and Lucy and her mother had a very close, warm, loving relationship. Maria was a very sweet, gentle person, a lot like Lucy. They were very, very similar. And actually, as Maria lay dying, Lucy was with her, and Lucy rocked her mother and sang her Rock of Ages as her mother passed away. So that says a lot about Lucy's spirituality. And then, as if that were not enough, they lost George, they lose Maria. In November, Rutherford's mother, Sophia, dies. So they had a triple tragedy there in a very short time. So Rutherford runs for for second term in Congress, but he really does not like being in Congress. He's away from his wife a lot, and while Lucy does come to visit, they've been separated during the 4 years of the war. They have not lived in the same household together for a long period of time. And actually, as Elizabeth and I were working on the content for the booklet that she put together for the trip for you, we came across a letter that he wrote Lucy, something to the effect of, he can't stand being apart from her. He just isn't going to tolerate this anymore. And he ends the letter with, "Don't you want to be with me?" Which I'm sure was an anguishing question for a husband to ask his wife after all the years that they had been married, but they just hadn't spent a lot of time together. So Rutherford's name is getting tossed around as a potential candidate for the governorship of Ohio, and he says, "Yes, I'm in, this sounds great. I really would rather come back to Ohio than be out here in Congress." And so that happens, and he does run, and he wins, becomes governor of Ohio, actually is elected to 2 terms. And then he says, "I'm retired, I'm done with politics, I'm heading to Spiegel Grove to live out the rest of my days." So he and the family move from Columbus to Spiegel Grove, sit through 1 term of Governor William Allen, and the Republican Party comes back to Hayes and says, we can't stand Governor Allen, would you please come back? We would like for you to run again for governor, and he does. But of course, that's the term that he never finishes because he is receives the Republican nomination for president and runs for president of the United States. Now, while he is running for president, one of the things the Democrats speak out against him about is being anti-Catholic. And they point to several things that he said when he was governor of Ohio that they say was very discriminatory against Catholics. And I went back and I looked some of that up to see what he actually was saying about Catholics at the time. And what he says, he makes a couple of comments about opposing Catholic schools. He did not believe that Catholics should start their own schools. And so what he writes is, he says, "I do oppose Catholic interference and all sectarian interference with political affairs, and especially in the schools." And that's what got quoted, and that's what got out a lot. But what he goes on to say, he explains why. And he says, "The young of all conditions of life are brought together and educated on terms of perfect equality. The tendency of this is to assimilate and to fuse together the various elements of our population to promote unity, harmony, and general goodwill in our American society." And so what he was saying is, if we keep creating all these factions of schools, we're never going to learn how to be one country. And so it wasn't that he was necessarily anti-Catholic. He just felt like the public schools were the best place to promote that unity that he wanted to see in American society. But it does come out when he's president when he's running for president that he's saying these things. And so his campaign biographer, who was none other than William Dean Howells, who happened to be a distant relative, he wrote a letter to Howells as Howells was writing this biography and said, this is what Hayes says, "Be careful not to commit me on religion, temperance, or free trade. Silence is the only safety." So we see him as the politician and the diplomat certainly coming out here. Well, as we know, he does win the election, a very complicated election, and it got even more complicated after the election, trying to decide if he or Tilden were going to become the 19th president of the United States, and it ends up being Hayes. And so the Washington Society is very aware that that he goes to church regularly. They don't know the complexities of his religious thinking, but they certainly know that Lucy is a devout Methodist, and they're very anxious to see which Methodist church that the Hayeses are going to go to. And the day after Hayes is inaugurated, he gets a letter from J.P. Newman, who was the pastor at the Metropolitan Methodist Church, and that was the church that the Grants had gone to. And so J.P. Newman writes the now President Hayes a letter and invites the Hayeses to come to the Metropolitan Church, and also mentions that a wealthy parishioner had given $5,000 for a pew just to be used in their church for presidential families. But on the first Sunday that Rutherford and Lucy are in Washington, D.C., they get dressed up for church, and they walk out of the White House, and they walk around the corner to the Foundry United Methodist Church at 14th and G Streets. And they continue to worship there throughout their stay in Washington, which is the reason why we're here. This isn't, of course, in its original location when Rutherford and Lucy were going to church there, but it's certainly the same congregation. And the reason why, it doesn't surprise me, of course, those of us who know Rutherford and Lucy very well know that they would not have been impressed at all by a $5,000 pew. And I'm sure chose Foundry because that's where they were the most comfortable. I think Anne had mentioned that the Hayeses were criticized for not riding in a carriage to church. And actually, in your booklets, we do have a copy of a news article that was in, I think, the New York Times, where they say that they've heard that the Hayeses are being criticized for walking to church and not riding in a carriage. And basically, the article says the President of the United States can do, he's not a king, and if he wants to walk, he can walk. And but it's just interesting how closely people were paying attention to that kind of thing. Go ahead, Elizabeth. I think I have, Governor. And there's the President and Mrs. Hayes. Okay, so here's Foundry United Methodist Church. So when I actually initially prepared these remarks for meeting a Methodist conference that was being held in Cleveland, Ohio. And when I first was preparing these remarks, I just wondered, I didn't know if Foundry United Methodist Church still existed, and so I did some research and found that yes, it did, not in its original location, but certainly still a very thriving congregation. And so on the website, I found this information, and I went back just earlier this week to confirm and make sure that this information was still on the website. I couldn't find it, so I don't know if you've updated the website. I found a couple of things that were similar, but I found a statement that said that Foundry is a historic, progressive, United Methodist Church that welcomes all, worships passionately, challenges the status quo, and seeks to transform the world through God's love. Drawing upon significant rituals and spiritualities, Foundry is innovative and pioneering in our efforts to be a place of positive change within Christianity, within our denomination, within ourselves, and in our world. And the motto, which I did check, the motto and the key scripture have not changed. And you may have seen it around, because I've seen it about 5 times already in the brief tour that we had walking around here this evening. But the motto is, love God, love each other, change the world. And the key scripture is Mark 12, verses 28 through 31. And I want you to pay very close attention to this. But the key scripture being Mark 12, 28, 31, is the scripture where a religious scholar asks Jesus, what is the most important commandment? And Jesus replies, the Lord your God is one. So love the Lord God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence and energy. And here is the second, love others as well as you love yourself. There is no commandment that ranks with these. Now, when I first read this, I thought that was very interesting because there's a very interesting tie between that particular Bible passage and President Hayes. And I will tell you that at the end of my remarks. So, Hayes, who has said, I'm not a Christian, I maybe think a little bit like a Christian, but I'm not really sure. He's wrestling with these ideas as you've heard in the diary entries and letters that I've read. But he's still going to church every day. He's going to, or every Sunday, and he's going with Lucy. He also, while he's president, every morning he and his cabinet prayed and read a passage out of the Bible. So for somebody who thinks they're not Christian, he certainly acts a lot like one. And actually on Sunday evenings, some of the cabinet members would come over to the White House, and I think it was Schertz. Was it Schertz that played the piano, and they would sing hymns and with these cabinet members and the family? So, again, somebody who is going through and carrying out in actions the tenets of Christianity, but maybe doesn't quite, maybe can't quite take that step to say, this is what I believe, which is kind of interesting. So Hayes, right from the get-go, said he was not going to run for a second term, and he does not. And so at the end of his term, 1881, he and Lucy go back to Spiegel Grove. Go ahead, Elizabeth. And so this is Rutherford and Lucy and their children sitting on and the daughter-in-law sitting on the steps of the veranda. Upon his return to Fremont, now that he's left office, Hayes talks about this being a very freeing experience for him. And now that he is not, he feels like he can be a little more critical, a little bit more outspoken about some social issues that in the world that he would like to change. Now, he could have, see the part of this beautiful veranda that he has, and of course those of us that work there and see it every day know how gorgeous it actually is. And he could sit in a very comfortable rocking chair, they could drink lemonade, they could relax. Their work was done. This is a man who had literally fought to hold our country together. When he was a lawyer, he defended escaped slaves, he defended people that he believed were mentally ill, trying to get them help instead of the noose. He had worked when he was a governor, he was a huge champion of prison reform. When he was president of the United States, education was one of the things that he fought very hard to get increased funding for education. He could have said, hey, I've done my thing, and now I'm retired and I'm going to enjoy life. But he doesn't. He continues to work very hard for these causes. In his post-presidency, he becomes president. He was the first president of the Slater Fund, which was a foundation in New York City that funded graduate-level education for African Americans. There was one young man that they denied. They read the information that he had submitted, and they thought, no, we're going to pass on this. We're not going to fund this person. This person then wrote a personal letter to President Hayes and said, I don't understand why I was rejected. I have all these great things going for me. Please give me another look. And so Hayes did give this person another look and said, you know what, maybe we ought to reconsider. So he goes back to the board and says, let's give this guy another look. And they did, and they agreed to give him the funding that he needed to go get his PhD. And he became the first African American in the United States to get a PhD, W.E.B. Du Bois. So Hayes had, in his post-presidency, considerable influence on social issues in our country. So what stirred him most was social activism, which I think ties right into the motto here of Foundry United Methodist Church. And I don't know what the motto was in the 1870s and 80s when Rutherford and Lucy lived here, but I think he would absolutely agree with your motto. Another thing, again, he was criticized for being anti-Catholic, but in his post-presidency, he praises Catholics quite a bit. He was often giving lectures about Catholic heroes in the Civil War. He would talk about how patriotic they were and how devoted they were to the Union causes. In fact, he was giving an address to the Cincinnati chapter of the Knights of Columbus, and he tells them, at the time, a lot of Catholics had been anti-Lincoln, and he says, as the Civil War broke out, your Archbishop strung the American flag in the crisis of our fate from the top of the cathedral in Cincinnati on April 15, 1861. The spire was beautiful before, but the Catholic prelate made it radiant with home and glory for our country. So he wrote that in spite of their party fidelity, they supported Lincoln in the United States at that time, which he very much admired. He continues to champion prison reform. He works alongside bishops, cardinals, priests, and clergy from many different denominations. He also becomes president of a national prison reform group. And so so you can see that he is not giving up. He is still using the power and the connections that he developed as president of the United States for the common good. So back in Fremont, he's still attending church. He's going to the Methodist Episcopal Church nearly every week with Lucy. He actually serves as a lay leader in the Methodist Church in Fremont. He donates liberally financially to the Methodist Church in Fremont. He paid for 1/4 of the building price of the church building twice because it burned down, and he gave that same amount for the second church. And even though Lucy was an official member and a couple of their children were official members, Hayes himself continually refused to join. They would go to revival meetings, but he would never step forward. So as much as he's living the life of a Christian, he couldn't make the step to actually declare that he was. He actually writes something very interesting in his diary about this time. He writes that Uncle Sardis was an admirer of John Ruskin, and Hayes himself, one of his favorite authors was Emerson. He writes about Emerson a lot in his diaries, and he says, even though Ruskin can't hold a candle to Emerson, there is one phrase of Ruskin's that he thought was particularly apt for the time. And this is a quote. He quotes this in his diary. This is by Ruskin, "The Mystery of Life in the Arts," which was written in 1869. And this is the quote that Hayes jots down in his diary. "Whenever in any religious faith, dark or bright, we are wrong." Whenever in any religious faith, dark or bright, we allow our minds to dwell upon the points in which we differ from other people, we are wrong and in the devil's power. That is the essence of the Pharisees' thanksgiving. Lord, thank thee that I am not as other men are, and so on. And so that's the quote that Hayes said he's really drawn to. And I got very interested in that quote, so I actually, thank you, Google, was able to Google that phrase and find out what came after it, because I was very curious. And so this is what comes immediately following the quote that Hayes has in his diary. At every moment of our lives, we should be trying to find out not in where we differ from other people, but in what we agree with them. And the moment we find we can agree as to anything that should be done, kind or good, and who but fools couldn't, then do it. Push at it together. You can't quarrel in a side-by-side push. But the moment that even the best men stop pushing and begin talking, they mistake their pugnacity for piety, and it's all over. And so what he's saying, and this is something that we see evidence of his entire life, he does not think that we should focus on what makes people different. We should focus on what they have in common. And we see this a lot, particularly in his presidency. He worked very hard. He wanted to heal the country. And people thought that he was being too conciliatory toward the South. But we can certainly see in how it relates to some of his philosophy or what's going on in his mind, some of these diary entries. He's very much a uniter to his core. But what really made him angry was when politics and religion intersected. That he did not care for. November 9th, 1885, he writes in his diary that, I'm quoting directly from the diary entry here, "I must sometime maintain my proposition that as a non-professor of religion, a mere man of the world, who wishes well to his country and his fellow men, ought actively to aid in the circulation of the Bible, and in adding to its influence. The general course of my argument is this. All peoples will have some religion. Death leads to mind to consider the future, to a contemplation of deity. Hence religion, or this is religion. Now the best religion the world has ever known is the religion of the Bible. It builds up all that is good. It suppresses or diminishes all that is bad. With it men are happy and nations are prosperous. Where it is not found, vice and crime prevail." Now this is a little bit different from the diary entry about 20 years earlier where he said, I read it because it's good literature. Now he's saying, no, it is good, and this is what people should use. And he mentions that a lot, that he doesn't like the fact that the church plays intermediary. He thinks people should be able to go directly to the Bible, and that's where they should receive their spiritual inspiration and guidance from. He does write, though, that he's very happy in going to these Methodist churches with Lucy. In fact, he writes that Methodism he thinks is one of the best. out of all the religions, and he makes some comment about how Orthodox Calvinists, that's such a gloomy philosophy that if it were really true, all joy in the world would be over. And so he thinks that Methodism is pretty okay and not as gloomy, and that's one of the things he likes about the Methodist Church. But he's worried about the Methodist Church, and he's worried that it's becoming too political, too concerned about money. And he writes in his diary that the church is losing hold on people by its greed for gold and for power and partisan politics. Money and partisanship are its twin evils. During the war, it drove out all the Democrats, and now it is expelling all the Republicans. It's anxiety for the million, not the millions of souls, but for the $1 million. On January 3rd of 1892, he writes in his diary, "Partisanship should be kept out of the pulpit. It blinds all minds to entertain it. You do no good, but harm and harm only when you preach partisan principles. Preachers are not replied to. No chance to reply to them. The balance wheel of free institutions is free discussion. The pulpit allows no free discussion." So here again, we see Hayes the scholar. He wants to debate these ministers, and when you're sitting in church in the congregation, you don't get the opportunity to do that. So he starts to also become, in his later years, he becomes concerned with as the church is becoming more focused on money and more focused on politics. He's also seeing a lot going on in society that he doesn't really like. And remember, this is the height of the Gilded Age, a lot of corruption, a lot of greed, and he's seeing it and he's speaking out against it. He writes in his diary, December 4th, 1887, Sunday, "In church it occurred to me that it is time for the public to hear that the giant evil and danger in this country, the danger which transcends all others, is the vast wealth owned or controlled by a few persons. Money is power. In Congress, in state legislatures, in city councils, in courts, in the political conventions, in the press, in the pulpit. In the circles of the educated and the talented, its influence is growing greater and greater. Excessive wealth in the hands of the few means extreme poverty, ignorance, vice, and wretchedness as the lot of the many. It is not yet time to debate about the remedy. The previous question is as to the danger, the evil. Let the people be fully informed and convinced as to the evil. Let them earnestly seek the remedy, and it will be found. Fully to know the evil is the first step towards reaching its eradication. Henry George is strong when he portrays the rottenness of the present system. We are, to say the least, not ready for his remedy. We may reach and remove the difficulty by changes in the laws, regulating corporations, descents of property, wills, trusts, taxation, and a host of other important interests, not omitting lands and other property." So I had to do some research on Henry George. I had heard of him. I thought of him as kind of an author. Go ahead, Elizabeth. So this is Henry George. This is who he's talking about, and who he's saying, I really like Henry George. He's got some great ideas. We're not ready for his ideas yet. Henry George was an author. He was a candidate for mayor in New York City. And according to Hayes, starts referring to him as a nihilist. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term. In today's standard, a nihilist, it comes from annihilate. It means somebody who wants no government. And I'm thinking, Hayes is admiring a nihilist? Like, this is very odd here. What's going on? So this is how Hayes defines the term nihilistic. I've got the quote right up there, March 18th, 1890. "I mean no disparagement by the word nihilistic. I use it to mean all opinions tending to show the wrong and evils of the money-piling tendency of our country, which is changing laws, government, and morals, and giving all power to the rich, and bringing in pauperism and its attendant crimes and wretchedness like a flood. Lincoln was for a government of the people. The new tendency is a government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. The man who sees this and opposed to it, I call a nihilist." Now, for a president of the United States to be saying he's in favor of nihilism or supports nihilism, I think it just blew me away. But when I see how he's defining it, it's almost a reformer. And Hayes, in his later years in his diary, refers to himself a lot as a reformer. But I think that's very interesting. He also talks about nihilism. He gives a speech at what's now Case Western Reserve University in Northeast Ohio. It was known as Western Reserve University at the time. He also talks about nihilism and how this is something that he really admires and thinks that people should be thinking about. But I also think what's interesting in the quote where he's admiring Henry George, he's also saying, but we're not ready for that yet. And this is one of the things I think is very interesting about Hayes is really kind of, the thinking that he has in the later years of his life, I think are very progressive for the era. But he's also saying as much as he wants these things to happen, he knows the country's not ready for it yet. He's almost worried that there would be too much of a backlash. If we make too many changes too soon, there's going to be a backlash, and he doesn't want that to happen. So while he's advocating for some of these things and thinking about some of these things, he also thinks that the American public should be taking some time and not do a knee-jerk reaction to some of the kind of social problems that he is identifying. Again, May 17th, 1890, this is just a few years before he dies. He writes in his diary, "I am not a subscriber to any creed. I belong to no church, but in a sense satisfactory to myself and believed by me to be important, I try to be a Christian, or rather, I want to be a Christian and to help do Christian work. So I'm not a Christian, but I want to be a Christian." Like, what kind of sense does that make? Next slide. So the tragic thing that happens just a few years before Hayes himself passes away, of course, Lucy predeceases him. She passes away in 1889, and he writes in his diary that she loved Christ and all good Christians. She cared very little for the formalities of religion, believed in the orthodox doctrines, but was as liberal and all-embracing in her charitable views as Christ himself. And then he writes the second quote there, "The charm of life left me when Lucy died. I believe in the moral government of the universe. I trust and have faith in the power, wisdom, and goodness of the divine ethereal." So he has many of the thoughts of a Christian, won't declare himself a Christian, even when Lucy dies. Believes that there's something else, believes that she's in a better place, but won't make that declaration for himself, which is kind of interesting. So Rutherford himself, then, he dies in 1893. He is up in Cleveland conducting business for the Ohio State University and has a heart attack. He's with his son Lev, who says, "Let's get you to a hospital." Rutherford says, "Nope, I'd rather die at Spiegel Grove than anywhere else." And so that's exactly what happens. The last words that he speaks are, "I know I'm going to where Lucy is." So ultimately, he believes that she's in some kind of a better place and that he is going there. Go ahead, Elizabeth. So at Hayes, there was a memorial service for Hayes down in Columbus, Ohio, and the person who gave that address was the Reverend Washington Gladden. And Gladden himself was a very prominent reformer and advocate for social change. And so I think Hayes would have been very, very pleased that Gladden was the one giving the address at his memorial service. Gladden was somebody who was so shocked by corruption in government that he himself runs, tries to make some changes. So it's Gladden who personally knew Hayes. Also, they were friends. Washington is the one who gives the memorial discourse at Columbus on the Sunday after President Hayes' death. And this is what Gladden has to say about Hayes. "I do not know that he formulated for himself any creed. He was content probably with a very short statement of some of the fundamental truths of religion. He was profoundly interested in the truth, which constitutes the heart of all faiths." And then he goes on to tell a story about a conversation that he and Rutherford had just shortly before Rutherford passed away. And this is where I want you to remember what that key scripture is for Foundry United Methodist Church. So he has a conversation with Hayes. Rutherford asks Gladden, "Do you know a certain minister who's also of the Congregational Church?" And Gladden replies, "Yes, I've known this man since my early seminary days." "Well," says Hayes with a humorous twinkle, "I heard him preach last Sunday at Brattleboro, Vermont," which of course is where Hayes' family was from, and so he had clearly been back there visiting some family. And Hayes tells Gladden, "The text of his sermon was a striking one. The second is like unto it. That was all of the text, but it was enough, I assure you, to furnish the foundation of a very strong discourse, which Hayes, of course, loved a very strong discourse. So Gladden goes on in his memorial address to say, I could easily believe it. It is what our master says about the second great commandment of law. The first great commandment is, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. The second is like unto it, equally binding, equally fundamental, equally religious. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And that is what is the key scripture here when Jesus is asked, which of the commandments is the most important? Love God, but the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. So Hayes, who in 1893, when he passed away, would have no idea what the key scripture of Foundry United Methodist Church was talking about that same scripture just shortly before he died. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And so Gladden ends his remarks with the following. I suppose if Hayes had been challenged to confess his faith, it would have been uttered in the words of the beloved apostle. He that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And I really think that for Hayes, who for whatever reason lived his life very much as a Christian, lived those according to the principles of Christianity, but couldn't get to the point where he could actually say, I am a Christian and I believe. But what becomes his religion is looking out for the welfare of other people and getting people to work together. And we see that not only in his own words where he's expressing in his diary, this is what I want to see. I want to see people working together. I want to see prison reform. I want to see, better education systems in our country. That is what he carries as, I think, his religious view, is that we were put here on this earth to, in fact, love our neighbor as ourselves. So why he couldn't ever actually make the call and make that statement and join a church, I don't know. But I believe that what his beliefs were, he certainly acted out on them at every point in his life. So that concludes my formal remarks. And I hope that I haven't put you to sleep. But do you have any questions? Okay, great. Oh, yeah.
The church he attended in Fremont, does that still exist?
It's still, I'm not sure that it's the same building, but the congregation is still there. And does any of the Hayes staff members know if the church that he and Lucy attended still stands? There is the Hayes Methodist Church, but that's not it. It's a newer building. It's not a Methodist church anymore, but the building is still there. Okay. 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 Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention.